Gavin Kennedy, an expert on negotiation, once wrote that preparation is the jewel in the crown of negotiating. Get this right, and merely doing it is not enough, and your performance in the negotiation dramatically improves. Professor Freeman, you might say, I want to know about something that's going to dramatically improve my performance in negotiation. What is it? In this session, we want to tie many of the ideas of the course together, add to them, and so discover the difference between how excellent negotiators and mediocre negotiators prepare. What specifically do they do differently when it comes to getting ready for important talks, and why does it make such a difference? To show you the difference it can make, I want to share with you a troubling story of a negotiation gone bad. My students never fail to be amazed and appalled by it. But it's a true story. In December 1984, Gene Fontaine is getting worried. Fontaine is an executive at an Oklahoma plastics company called Pacific Oil. And for the last few years, everything has been just ducky. Sales have been strong, competition weak, and a couple of years ago, Pacific Oil easily resigned its biggest customer, a German firm called Reliant, to a second nice, juicy 4-year deal. But suddenly, Fontaine realizes things are about to change. As he reviews all his contracts and reads up on market trends, he notices a glut's coming. Within 18 months, competitors are going to flood the market with new supplies of cheap plastic. Fontaine is worried they'll tempt Reliant away when the new contract ends in 2 years. And then Fontaine and his firm will be in big trouble because there aren't many buyers out there like Reliant. What to do? He decides on a daring strategy. He'll ask Reliant now, a couple of years early, to renew and extend its current contract, locking them in till the end of the decade and beyond. To get ready, he writes down several arguments he'll make. He'll emphasize their excellent relationship and Pacific Oil's excellent service and quality. He'll remind them the company built a pipeline for Reliant, no small thing. And he'll even be ready to cut the price a tiny bit, maybe 1/4 cent a pound. But if the last renewal is any indication, that probably won't be necessary. In fact, he tells his aide, things should go pretty quickly and they'll likely renew on similar terms. So he calls his old counterpart at Reliant. Surprise, the guy's gone. A new guy, Hauptmann, is the lead negotiator now. Hauptmann's interested. Come see us, he says. So Fontaine and his aide fly to Reliant's headquarters in Berlin to talk about renewing them early. And so begins an odyssey that lasts over a year. To Fontaine's surprise, every time the two meet, Hauptmann says, we are making very good progress. We are very close to an agreement. There's just one more thing we need. And then Hauptmann makes a spectacular one-sided demand that Fontaine hasn't been expecting. Also, to Fontaine's surprise, each time Hauptmann is adamant about the demand. This is what we want, and we cannot make any further progress on any other issue unless we get it. Sometimes Fontaine is so surprised that all he can say is, wow, that's a big request. I have to think long and hard about that one. But eventually, he concedes a lot on every point. Sometimes Fontaine briefly tries to counteroffer, only to find that Hauptmann is implacable. Hauptmann's only willing to concede a little bit, and then only grudgingly. Over the months, Hauptmann's demand escalate. We want lower prices. We want a lower minimum volume. We want price guarantees. We want just a 2-year contract extension. Even, we want big concessions to the current contract. Fontaine basically agrees to all these demands. Now the talks have gone on for 13 months with no end in sight. And now, Hauptmann is demanding the right to resell the raw plastic and so become Pacific Oil's competitor if it wants to. At this point, even Fontaine's bosses are getting worried. But after careful thought, Fontaine agrees to this last concession. Do we have a deal, he asks. This is very good news, says Hauptmann. There's just one more thing we need. And we don't know what happened after that, but frankly, it doesn't matter. Because if Pacific Oil signs this terrible deal, they may come close to bankrupting themselves. And if they don't, Reliant will say, no problem, we will just file it away. And when it's time to renew, we'll take it out and start there, knowing we'll have lots of other suppliers to buy from unless we get everything we want. The Pacific Oil case is a cautionary tale. And as my students dissect what went wrong, they quickly realize the problem. Fontaine was unprepared. There were lots of things he should have learned and thought about beforehand, but he never did any of those things. After he decided to negotiate, he just jotted down some not-so-convincing arguments and expected smooth sailing. The scary thing is that Fontaine looked ready. He was foresighted, proactive, diligent, and clearly did some homework to discover the coming glut. But he didn't come close to being ready for the talks themselves. And as a result, he invited his counterpart to be completely positional, to use a variety of sharp bargaining tactics, and so produce an extraordinarily one-sided deal. It's a slow-motion train wreck, a true story and a tragedy. But be of good cheer. We can learn from Fontaine's mistakes and transcend them, discovering efficient ways to prepare well that often can make you far more effective than you first imagined. I've also mentioned before a milestone 1984 study by Neil Rackham comparing 48 excellent negotiators with 48 mediocre negotiators. One of the more surprising findings was this. No significant difference was found in the total planning time which skilled and average negotiators claimed they spent prior to actual negotiation. Now, we may have to take this finding with a grain of salt because it's based on self-reporting by the negotiators themselves. But as Rackham notes, it suggests the conclusion that it's not the amount of planning time which makes for success, but how that time is used. So what are the keys to good preparation? Well, welcome to the I foresaw it mnemonic. The I foresaw it is a 10-letter memory tool I've created that sums up what skilled negotiators do to systematically prepare for important talks. Each letter stands for a word, and each word stands for a question you want to ask and then answer before you enter the talks. Here's what the letters stand for. Interests, factual and financial research, options, rapport, reaction and responses, empathy and ethics, setting and scheduling, alternatives to agreement, who, independent criteria, topics, targets, and trade-offs. Many of these terms refer to ideas we've already explored, so they may already feel familiar to you. And as we'll see, the mnemonic follows a certain logical flow. You can start at the beginning and work your way to the end, and it really will guide you. But you don't have to. You can start anywhere and jump around. In fact, as you answer one section, you often naturally come up with ideas that belong in another section. So there's a kind of a natural self-reinforcing quality. However you want to use it, the I foresaw it can help you, as many of my students will attest. You can use the I foresaw it in as few as 15 minutes in a crisis, and it really will help you. For important talks, you may want to take considerably more time. Hours, days, weeks, perhaps even more. Now, you may hear all this and say, wait a minute, it sounds like you're going to give me the equivalent of a questionnaire to fill out. If I do, I guess I'll wind up with a long list of material, ideas, and data. But Professor Freeman, what do I do with all that stuff? It's not going to give me a step-by-step guide. Say this now, say that next. I won't be able to refer to this in the thick of the conversation. It'll just be a set of notes. So how does the I foresaw it really help me? Good question. So let me let you in on a secret. Though I strongly encourage my students to talk to me when they have problems, I've discovered something. Answers don't work. Though students are always polite, I can tell they struggle to accept my advice. But it's not personal. Studies find that most advisors have the same problem. Answers, it turns out, don't work. But I found something that does. Questions. questions work. Questions rock. When a student seeks my help, if I can just listen and ask a few simple questions, often the student will say, "That's a good question." Ever have that situation where somebody asks you a question and it opens something up for you? Well, guess what? The I for SOIT is a collection of 10 proven, powerful questions. So I won't solve your negotiating problem, you will. In that sense, the mnemonic is a truly empowering exercise. One quick illustration. I'm often amazed how useful it is to ask, "What do you want here?" I can't tell you how many times my students will reply, "Yeah, that's a very good question. I really have to think that one through." "Really?" "Yeah." That question is essentially the first one in the I for SOIT. Let's make things interesting by throwing you into a crisis scenario that's based on a real set of events. Imagine your parents, your sibling, and you made weekend reservations at the 4-star Omega Hotel in Chicago so that you can attend a wedding nearby on Sunday evening. You booked using an American Express card and got a confirmed reservation for one room with a double bed for your parents, a single bed for your sister, and a folding bed for yourself. The cost of the room was $99 per night, or approximately $200 for the entire weekend. But once you arrive at the hotel, while standing in line at the registration counter, you overhear incoming guests ahead of you being told of a problem with their rooms. Apparently, the rooms they reserved are still occupied by the previous guests, and those guests have chosen to extend their visit one more night. The desk clerk tells them that the city of Chicago prohibits the hotel from evicting guests in such a situation. She says the Omega will give the new guests a free taxi to the Whitman Hotel, a nearby 4-star, where they will have a similar room at the same rate. She says they'll call them tomorrow if rooms become ready at the Omega. You have a strong feeling you'll have the same problem. You may wind up spending your weekend packing and repacking, moving back and forth between two hotels, and not even getting compensation for the inconvenience. So before reaching the desk, you ask your family to step out of line. You explain it would be wise to systematically prepare in case there's a problem with your room too. So here you are, sitting in the lounge with your bags. Can you and your family transform the situation with the help of the I for SOIT? Well, there it is. A classic travel problem and a true case one of my students experienced. And in just a moment, we'll see whether the I for SOIT can make a difference. But wait. Come on. Who in his right mind, in the middle of a travel crisis, says to himself, "I ought to do a homework assignment right now"? Excellent question. You know what? Let's drop the idea. Let's just see how normal people might deal with the situation without all this busy work. So imagine you just ask the desk clerk for your room. The clerk apologizes and explains she's going to give you the same deal that she gave the group ahead of you. You reply, "That's not acceptable. I want my room, please." And she apologizes and says, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry, ma'am, but my hands are tied." You ask for an upgrade. She says there's no other rooms in the hotel. You ask to speak with the manager. She says he's not here. Now you're flummoxed. You complain for a while. She's polite, but unmoved. Now what do you do? A few years ago, the Wall Street Journal reported that overbooking had become epidemic at hotels. As a result, compared to the prior year, there had been a 44% increase in assault cases between guests and clerks. And you can see why. You're tired, unprepared for a booking problem, dismayed when they tell you you don't have a room, and find you're quickly escalated ineffectively. One thing leads to another, and you find yourself in jail. Okay, probably not jail, but probably very unsatisfied. So maybe, just maybe, there's method to the seeming madness of taking a step away and thinking systematically for a little while about the problem and how to solve it. So let's take out a piece of paper and write at the top, I for SOIT plan Omega Hotel. Then, in the upper left-hand corner, let's write the letter I and spell out the word interests. And so we've begun the process. We're about to systematically think about each of the questions, starting with this one. What are my and my family's interests here? What are the other side's interests here? What common interests do we share? But wait, why are we asking these questions? Shouldn't we just go up and demand room 1401? As we saw in our first session, making a positional demand sometimes works, but very often it doesn't. If there's only one thing that can make you happy, and the other side can't or won't give it to you, you're heading for a positional impasse, and you may be tempted to escalate ineffectively to break that impasse. Counterintuitively, you can dramatically improve your chances for becoming happy if you look beyond your position and think about your interests. That's because there may be many ways to satisfy those interests. Room 1401 may be only one of many solutions. The better we understand the interests, the better the chance that we'll find creative options that meet them well. So what are your and your family's interests here? Quickly, you identify several. Convenience, that is, being close to the wedding. Stay put without having to pack and repack. Some compensation for your troubles, and fair and respectful treatment. We'll use that list soon to help us discover possible solutions, and we'll also want to use it to test any offer we receive to make sure it satisfies our needs, so this list is doubly helpful. The next question is this: what are the other side's interests? But wait, your mother can't understand why we're bothering with this question. What will you tell her? As we saw in the first and second sessions, the better we understand the other person's interests, the better we have a chance of finding creative options that we'll both be satisfied with. Mom, you might say, we're doing this to give you the most chances to be happy. So what are the hotel's interests? You quickly list a few. Reputation, repeat business, abide by the law, and reasonably control costs. That helps in several ways. First, it helps you realize that some ideas will clearly be non-starters, like, hey, just throw those people out of our room. It's against the law. But now you also see better that the hotel probably knows that it has a problem and may welcome help solving it if it's reasonable. Since you're dealing directly with the clerk, it's also useful to list her separate interests. Those include looking good to her boss, keeping customers reasonably happy, not being abused, and keeping her job. That's valuable too. Most unhappy hotel guests treat clerks badly in these situations and falsely assume the clerk is an enemy. But the clerk will be much more willing to help if you see her more accurately than that at least. What are common interests? As we saw in Lecture 6, common interests can be particularly persuasive because they build trust and encourage collaboration. Here you have several. You both want a fair outcome. You both want to resolve the matter quickly, and you both want to be civil and polite. When the conversation becomes tense, you can diffuse it by simply saying, I know we're a bit frustrated at the moment, but we're on the same side here. If we work together, we can come up with a fair outcome quickly and amicably. I know you want to be fair, and I do too. That brings us to the next letter of the I foresaw it mnemonic, F. So we can write factual and financial research. As we saw in Lecture 4, knowledge is power, and so skilled negotiators want to learn as much as they reasonably can on the eve of a negotiation. What research would you like to do before you go to talk to the clerk here at the Omega? You might want to go online and find out about other hotels. You might want to check with your Chicago family for advice. You might want to talk to other guests to find out what they've been offered. You could check with the Chicago Tourist Board and find out what the law really is. And you might want to call American Express or another travel advisor and find out what the industry standard is in such a situation. When you call American Express, they tell you the industry standard is that a 4-star hotel will give 1 free night at a nearby peer hotel, and sometimes 2 nights, if it can't keep the reservation. How do you feel now? Thanks to your quick research, you've discovered a powerful piece of information. When the time comes, you can say something like this: I know we both want to be fair, so to be sure I was being fair, I checked with American Express to see what's appropriate in situations like this. Here's what they tell me is the norm for top hotels like yours. I'd be happy to share their number with you if you'd like. Since the Omega is a top hotel, I wonder if we could follow the industry standard. Here, you've appealed to solid facts, a credible third party, and a common interest in fairness, and proposed a solution that meets each of the key interests you have well. You're not home free, but your bargaining power has clearly improved. The next letter is O for options. In our 5th session, we explored the power of creative options. As we've seen, Rackham found that excellent negotiators consider over 5 options per negotiable issue. Since I want you to be an excellent negotiator, I want you to develop 6 per topic. So here, as we've seen, the idea is simply to brainstorm. Then, later, you can group them into categories. Here at the Omega, there are many critical options you might want to consider. Stay at the Whitman for 2 nights. Receive a cash settlement and use it to find your own new hotel room. Ask for a free upgrade for Sunday night. Cover all meals and transfer costs. Get frequent flyer miles to defray the cost of the flight home. And so on. Many of these ideas will not work. 1 or 2 of them may be brilliant. You won't suggest more than 1 or 2 at first, but if the clerk says no, you can turn to the next, and so on. The next letter is R for rapport, reactions, and responses. As we saw in our 1st and 6th session, skilled negotiators want to be hard on the problem, soft on the person, and so they carefully think about ways to build rapport and connection. But they also prepare themselves to respond to hard reactions. Here at the Omega, you first want to jot down a couple of things you want to say at the outset to set the right tone. It could be as simple as this: "Hi, how are you? And looks like you're having a bit of a challenging evening." There's no one right phrase. The key is showing intentional respect. But what if the clerk quickly pushes back with phrases like, "This is all I can give you," or "Your suggestion is against policy," or "I don't have any authority to give you what you're asking for"? Fortunately, you'll be ready, because every part of the I foresaw it and your negotiation training can help you develop good responses. For example, if she says, "I don't have any authority to do that for you," you can reply, "That's okay. I wonder if there are things you do have authority to do that might help." And then you can suggest another creative option. Or you could say, "That's okay. Should I speak to the manager about that?" That is, change who you speak with. You won't have a great response ready to go for every reaction, but practice can help. So as we've said, you may want to take this further and actually do a quick role play with your family. That's a good way to get ready emotionally and predict likely challenges. The next letter is E, empathy and ethics. As we saw in our 2nd session, the ability to deeply understand the other negotiator is vital. As we said, I believe it's important for its own sake, regardless of whether it gains us anything. But fortunately, it happens that empathy can also help you negotiate much better. Here at the Omega, thinking about the situation from the clerk's perspective can be revealing. So, presto, you're the clerk now. How do things look from behind the desk? You probably feel stressed, wishing you could help, tired of being attacked by one angry customer after another, and worried if you give some special deal to one customer, all the rest will demand it too, which may put you in trouble with your boss. Notice anything? The clerk is probably struggling and may be interested in helping but unsure how to do it without giving away the store. To help her help you then, you may need to be more than just polite. You may need to offer her choices and do it discreetly, so she can quietly and safely agree with you if she wishes. The letter E also stands for ethics, and as we'll see in more detail in our next session, There are many ethical traps to watch for in negotiations and conflicts. Spotting them can be a very practical way to avoid problems. For example, here at the Omega, the clerk seems to face an ethical dilemma herself. If she gives you the hotel room, she breaks the law. If she doesn't, she breaks the hotel's promise. Demanding that she throw the other guests out only pushes her further into that dilemma, which will frustrate her and do you no good. Good thing you spotted that. The next letter is S, which stands for setting and scheduling. As we saw in session 13, setting and scheduling can be hidden influencers that skilled negotiators think about carefully. Here at the Omega, speaking loudly in front of the large group of other guests may put the clerk on the defensive and make it much harder for her to change her mind. Speaking discreetly off to the side may have the opposite effect. Similarly, scheduling the conversation for a moment when there aren't so many people around may also help. The next letter is A, which stands for alternatives to agreement. As we saw in our 8th session, understanding what each side can do if there's no deal is central to gauging how much relative power or leverage you have in the negotiation, as well as a key to knowing when to walk away, when to give in, and when to negotiate. Recall that it's wise to list 5 possible alternatives to agreement that each side has, so you don't miss something. Here at the Omega, your alternatives include staying at another hotel without the Omega's help, complaining to the CEO, staying with relatives, making a stink on the internet, and complaining to travel organizations. The Omega's alternatives include simply refusing us, losing us as customers, perhaps losing others as well, relying on other customers to show up when the current occupants leave. A lot depends on how busy things are in the city and at the hotel this weekend, which may deserve some further research. The next letter is W, which stands for who. As we saw in our 13th session, skilled negotiators find strength and insight by listing who else away from the talks may be influential. Here at the Omega, that list includes your family, the bride and groom, competing hotels, the city of Chicago, American Express, other customers, and perhaps most importantly, the clerk's boss. This list suggests people we may want to contact for help and advice, and people whose agreement we must also win. Making a proposal that the clerk can happily share with her boss may be essential, and keeping her boss in mind will help you frame the discussion in winsome ways. Since other excellent hotels seem to offer 2 free nights in many cases, and since American Express confirms that, I wonder if that might be a basis to reach out to your boss for permission. The next letter is I, which stands for independent criteria. As we saw in session 4, these are objective standards, trustworthy benchmarks that can be persuasive because both sides find them credible. Here at the Omega, your factual research revealed one, the industry standard, as reported by American Express. We've already talked about its potential persuasive power. If time permits, we may want to strengthen it by finding additional benchmarks, so that if the clerk rejects American Express, we can show further reasonableness by sharing a second one. The last letter, T, stands for topics, targets, and trade-offs, which we explored in session 12. As we saw there, it's the summation of the plan where we organize key points about creative and competitive aspects on a single sheet. So what happened in the actual case of the Omega Hotel story that the Omega Hotel story is based on? As my student, who I will call Dan, found, excellent things happened when he and his family stepped out of line and spent 15 minutes going through the I foresaw it mnemonic. Before I began the I foresaw it with my family, he wrote, I was furious, but we all started to relax during the exercise. Once it was time to confront the clerk at the front desk, I felt extremely confident, knowing that I was prepared to negotiate if necessary. Like us, Their research quickly revealed powerful insights. Also, they generated 15 creative options, one of which really worked. But it was empathy that may have been the most important thing that he thought about. Because he took a step back and really thought about what the clerk was going through, Dan was able to genuinely understand her, which helped him develop a fair, creative proposal and present it with patience and compassion that others never showed. The trust he built with her prompted her to call her boss at home and urge him to okay Dan's proposal, which he did. What was the agreement? 2 rooms at the Whitman for 2 nights, a $640 value for $198, an agreement that satisfied both sides' interests well and that Dan achieved while showing kindness and respect and receiving it in turn. If we test the agreement out using the 3 measures of success we developed in session 11, we find it was a brilliant success. It satisfied the interests, it was favorable, and it was a fair deal handled fairly, one that was gentle and positive on the relationships. Which brings us finally back to poor Fontaine and Pacific Oil. Why did he do so badly? It turns out that although he did lots of busy work, he considered almost none of the ideas we've just considered in the I foresaw it. So my challenge to you is to succeed where he failed, soar where he fell, by doing an I foresaw it plan before your next important negotiation. As rich and useful as it is, the I foresaw it can do more than we've just explored. It can also help you cope with one of the things that most bedevils you when you think about negotiation: counterparts who use sharp bargaining tactics against you. At the same time, the I foresaw it can save you from being blindsided by ethical traps, from temptations to compromise your reputation and behave badly despite your better judgment. Sharp tactics and ethical traps are a serious challenge to negotiators, so we'll explore specific ways to deal with them well in our next session.